For over 600 years, one empire ruled 3 continents. It controlled the gates between East and West. It collected taxes from Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike. It crushed every army that dared to challenge it. Rome fell. The Mongols scattered. The Crusaders were driven into the sea. The Byzantine Empire, which had survived for over 1,000 years, collapsed in a single afternoon. But the Ottomans? They kept growing. Historians call it the longest-lasting empire in recorded history. 600 years. 25 generations of rulers. Dozens of conquered civilizations absorbed and transformed. But here is the question nobody really answers. Why them? Why did the Ottomans succeed where every other empire eventually failed? The answer is not what you learned in school. It is darker, stranger, and far more brilliant than any textbook will tell you. This is the real story of the Ottoman Empire. In the year 1299, a small Turkish tribe settled near the Byzantine frontier in northwest Anatolia, the land we now call Turkey. Their leader was a man named Osman I. His territory was tiny. His army was small. His resources were almost nothing. Nobody at the time would have predicted what was coming. 100 years later, his descendants had consumed most of Anatolia and pushed deep into Europe. 150 years later, they seized Constantinople, the most fortified city on earth, the city that had never fallen, the city that controlled all trade between Europe and Asia. 200 years after Osman, the empire stretched from Hungary in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. From Algeria in the west to the Caucasus Mountains in the east. At its peak, the Ottoman Empire was home to over 30 million people speaking dozens of languages, practicing 3 major religions, living under a single sultan. But here is what history books miss. Size alone is not impressive. The Mongol Empire was larger. The Roman Empire was older. The British Empire was more widespread. What made the Ottomans different was not how big they got. It was how long they lasted. And how they stayed powerful. That required a system. And that system had 3 secrets. Secret number 1. The blood tax. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through Christian villages in the Balkans, in Greece, in Serbia, in Bulgaria, in Albania. And they would take children. Not to kill them. Not to enslave them in the traditional sense. To transform them. This was called the Devshirme. The word means collection in Ottoman Turkish. Boys between the ages of 8 and 18 were selected, the strongest, the smartest, the most promising. They were separated from their families. Converted to Islam. Given new names. Moved to Istanbul. And then the education began. They learned Ottoman Turkish. They studied Islamic law and theology. They trained in archery, horsemanship, wrestling, and sword fighting. The most gifted were sent to the palace school, where they studied mathematics, music, calligraphy, and statecraft alongside Ottoman princes. The best of them became Janissaries. The Janissaries were the elite infantry of the Ottoman military, the first standing professional army in Europe. They lived in barracks. They trained constantly. They were paid year-round, not just during campaigns. They were forbidden from marrying during their active service. Their entire identity was the army. Their entire loyalty was to the Sultan. For 200 years, they were the most feared soldiers on the European continent. When the Janissaries charged, entire armies broke and ran. But many Devshirme boys never became soldiers at all. Some rose through the palace administration to become governors of provinces larger than most European kingdoms. Others became admirals, diplomats, architects, and judges. And some became grand viziers, the second most powerful position in the entire empire, responsible for managing the day-to-day rule of tens of millions of people. Now think carefully about what this means. The Sultan's most loyal servants, the men who commanded his armies, governed his territories, and enforced his will, were not his relatives. They were not noblemen with inherited land and competing ambitions. They were former Christian children who had been taken from everything they knew and rebuilt from the ground up. They had no tribe, no family land, no noble lineage to protect, no competing clan loyalty. Everything they had, their rank, their salary, their homes, their very identity, came from the Sultan alone. And the Sultan could take it all away. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate design to solve the oldest problem in empire building: how do you prevent your most powerful men from becoming your most dangerous enemies? The answer the Ottomans found was to create men who had no power except the power the Sultan gave them. It was brutal. It separated children from their parents forever. It erased their original identities. It forced conversion under pressure. But as a system of loyalty engineering, it was almost perfect. And it worked for over 300 years. Secret number 2. The tolerance strategy. Here is something most people get wrong about the Ottomans. They think conquest meant conversion. They think the empire forced everyone it absorbed to become Muslim. That is not what happened. When Sultan Mehmed II rode into Constantinople on the 29th of May, 1453, his first act was not to burn the churches. It was to summon the Greek Orthodox Patriarch and guarantee the continuation of the Orthodox Church. The greatest cathedral in Christendom, the Hagia Sophia, was converted into a mosque. But the Greek Orthodox community kept its institutions, its clergy, its internal courts, and its religious schools. Jews who had been expelled from Spain in 1492, tens of thousands of them, were invited to settle in Ottoman cities. Mehmed II reportedly said that King Ferdinand of Spain was foolish to impoverish his own kingdom by expelling such productive subjects. The Ottomans took them in. Armenian Christians, Catholic traders from Genoa and Venice, Coptic Christians from Egypt, Zoroastrians, and dozens of other groups all lived within the Ottoman system under an arrangement called the Millet. Each millet, each recognized community, governed itself internally. Your community handled your marriages, your inheritance disputes, your religious education, your local courts. You paid your taxes to the Sultan. And in return, you were protected. You were not fully equal to a Muslim Ottoman subject. There were restrictions. There were extra taxes for non-Muslims. There were limits on building new churches or synagogues without permission. But you were alive. You were allowed to work. You were allowed to trade. And in an era when European kingdoms were burning heretics and launching religious wars that killed millions of their own people, that was not a small thing. The strategic genius here was economic. Conquered people who feel relatively secure do not rebel constantly. They build. They farm. They manufacture. They trade. And they pay taxes. Those taxes funded the military that kept conquering new territory, which brought in more tax revenue, which funded a larger military. The Ottomans ran the most important trade routes in the world, the Silk Road connections between Europe and Asia, the spice routes through Egypt, the Black Sea grain trade. All of that required merchants. Merchants required security. Security required an empire willing to protect commerce rather than terrorize it. The Millet system was not generosity. It was a business model. While the kings of France and Spain were executing their own subjects over whether communion was symbolic or literal, the Sultan in Istanbul was calmly collecting taxes from Catholics, Orthodox Christians, Jews, Armenians, and Sunni Muslims simultaneously. One empire. Many peoples. Maximum revenue. Secret number 3. They changed how war was fought. In 1453, the walls of Constantinople had protected the city for over 1,000 years. They had repelled Arab armies. They had stopped the Bulgarians. They had survived Viking raids, Crusader sieges, and everything else the medieval world could throw at them. The walls were 30 feet high in places, backed by a deep moat, reinforced by towers every 150 feet. Military engineers considered them essentially impenetrable with existing technology. Mehmed II decided that existing technology was the problem. He commissioned a Hungarian artillery engineer named Urban, a man who had previously offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor, been told the Byzantines could not afford him, and then watched in surprise as the Ottomans paid him 4 times his asking price. Urban built the largest cannon that had ever been constructed. It was called the Basilica. It was over 8 meters long. It fired stone cannonballs weighing over 500 kilograms. It took 60 oxen to move it and a crew of 200 men to operate. When the Basilica fired for the first time, the sound could be heard 20 miles away. People who heard it for the first time thought an earthquake had struck. The walls that had never been breached in 1,000 years began to crack within weeks. Constantinople fell on May 29, 1453. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died fighting in the breach. But the Ottomans did not stop at big cannons. They kept adapting. When gunpowder weapons became available through Chinese and Islamic trade networks, the Ottomans systematically integrated firearms into their military doctrine faster than almost any European power. The Janissaries became the first standing European army to use firearms, early matchlock rifles, as a standard part of field battle formation. This sounds obvious to modern ears. It was revolutionary at the time. European armies in the 15th century were still organized around armored knights, feudal levies, and traditional infantry formations built around spears and crossbows. Firearms were considered unreliable, slow to reload, and awkward in battle. The Janissaries trained with their firearms until they could reload under pressure. They developed formations that combined gunfire with traditional weapons. They turned firearms from a curiosity into a decisive battlefield tool. By the time European armies caught up to Ottoman military doctrine, the Ottomans had already used it to conquer the Middle East, North Africa, southeastern Europe, and the territories that would become modern-day Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Greece. They did not just win wars. They rewrote the rules that governed how wars were won. So if the system was so powerful, why did it eventually collapse? The honest answer is that the very things that made the Ottomans great eventually became the things that destroyed them. The Devshirme system produced Janissaries so powerful, so embedded in the palace economy, that by the 17th century they had become a political force unto themselves. They chose which sultans lived and which died. They vetoed military reforms that threatened their privileges. An army that had once been the Sultan's greatest weapon had become his most dangerous domestic threat. The Millet system, which had worked brilliantly in the age of religious identity, began to fracture in the 19th century as European nationalism spread into Ottoman territories. Communities that had coexisted for centuries began demanding separate nation-states. The Greeks revolted in the 1820s. The Serbs, the Romanians, the Bulgarians followed. Each successful revolt carved off another piece of the empire. And while Europe was industrializing, building railways, steel industries, mechanized agriculture, and modern artillery, the Ottomans were struggling to finance reforms that their own political factions kept blocking. The empire that had outfought and outthought every rival for 6 centuries entered the 20th century weakened, indebted, and surrounded by more technologically advanced enemies. It collapsed at the end of the First World War. The last sultan was deposed in 1922. The Turkish Republic was declared in 1923. 624 years after Osman I rode out of the hills of Anatolia with a small tribe and an enormous ambition, it was over. But here is what I want you to take away from this story. For most of those 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire was the most sophisticated, most stable, and most powerful political entity on earth. Not by accident. Not by luck. Not by having more land or more people than everyone else. By having better systems. Systems for loyalty. Systems for tolerance. Systems for military innovation. Systems that turned every resource, even conquered enemies, into instruments of continued power. That is the secret history of the Ottoman Empire. Not just what they conquered, but how they thought. The